I offered to pay for their baby's first year of daycare. The next week, my daughter-in-law mocked me in front of friends, saying he's trying to buy relevance. My son said she's just joking. I went silent. But later that week, she opened an envelope that wasn't a check. It was a formal notice that would make her. I've never been the kind of man who needed recognition. For most of my life, I worked quietly, methodically, the way my father taught me. You show up early, you leave late, and you don't complain about either. I built my career in commercial real estate development, not flashy skyscrapers with my name stamped on them, but solid, profitable projects that made other people wealthy while I stayed comfortably in the background. By the time I turned 62, I had more than enough. Not buy a yacht and brag about it, money, but enough to never worry again, enough to help my family, enough to feel like I had earned the right to slow down. And that's exactly what I planned to do. My son Daniel was 32. He had a good job in logistics, stable, predictable, not ambitious in the way I had been, but dependable. I respected that. He married Claire 3 years ago. Claire was harder to read. At first, I thought she was just confident. She spoke sharply, always had something to say, always the loudest voice in the room, the kind of person who filled silence quickly, like it made her uncomfortable. I tried to like her, I really did. I paid for half their wedding, at Daniel's request, not hers. She never thanked me directly, but I told myself that wasn't important. People show appreciation in different ways. Then came the baby. My granddaughter, Lily. The first time I held her, everything else, business, money, reputation, felt irrelevant. She was small, warm, completely unaware of the complicated world she'd been born into. I remember thinking, this is what all of it was for. Daniel and Claire struggled during those first few months, not financially in a dire sense, but enough that I could see the stress settling into their lives. Claire took maternity leave, unpaid after a certain point. Daniel picked up extra hours. They argued more often, quietly at first, then less so. Daycare became the looming problem. Good daycare wasn't cheap, not in their area, not anywhere worth trusting. I didn't offer immediately, I waited, watched. Pride matters, especially for a man like Daniel. I didn't want to make him feel small. But one evening, after dinner at their place, I noticed something. Claire was at the kitchen counter, scrolling through her phone, her face tight. Daniel was holding Lily, packing slowly. "How much is the one you liked?" he asked. "Too much," she replied flatly. There was a pause. Not an ordinary pause, the kind that hangs heavy because both people already know the answer, they just don't want to say it out loud. That's when I stepped in. "I'll cover it," I said. They both turned toward me. "The daycare," I clarified. "First year, let me handle it." Daniel blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Dad, you don't have to." "I know," I said calmly. "I want to." Claire said nothing at first. She just stared at me, her expression unreadable. Then slowly, she smiled. It wasn't warm, it wasn't cold either, just measured. "Well," she said, "that would definitely make things easier." Daniel looked relieved, genuinely relieved. And that was enough for me. "I'll arrange everything," I said. "You just pick the place you trust." That night when I drove home, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. Not the kind tied to contracts or negotiations, something quieter, more personal. I wasn't trying to control anything. I wasn't trying to insert myself into their lives. I just wanted to help. The next few days were simple. Daniel sent me options. I reviewed them, checked reputations, made a few calls. Old habits die hard. I wasn't about to pay for something without knowing exactly what I was getting. We settled on a well-regarded daycare about 15 minutes from their home. Clean, structured, excellent staff. Expensive, but worth it. I told them I'd handle the payments directly, set it up annually, one less thing for them to think about. Daniel thanked me more than once. Claire didn't say much, but she didn't object either. I took that as acceptance. And in my world, acceptance was enough. A week later, Claire invited me over for a small gathering. "Just a few friends," she said over the phone, "nothing big." I hesitated for a moment. Social events weren't my preference. But then she added, "We want you there." That was new. So I agreed. I didn't know then that this would be the last quiet moment before everything changed. Or that a simple offer, one I made without expectation, would be turned into something else entirely. Something I couldn't ignore. Something I wouldn't forgive. I almost didn't go. That's the part I keep coming back to, the small, almost invisible decision that could have changed everything. If I had trusted my instincts, if I had chosen comfort over obligation, I would have stayed home that night. But I didn't. I showed up 10 minutes early, the way I always do. Old habits, respect for other people's time, even in informal settings. Daniel opened the door, smiling, a drink already in his hand. "Hey Dad," he said, stepping aside to let me in. "You didn't have to be early." "I know," I replied, "I prefer it." The house smelled like wine and something baked. Claire's doing, no doubt. She liked presentation. Everything looked curated. The lighting was warm, the furniture arranged just slightly differently than usual, like she had staged the room for an audience. Which I realized quickly she had. There were 6 other people there, 2 couples I didn't recognize, and 1 woman sitting alone on the couch scrolling through her phone. Everyone looked polished, not overly formal but deliberate, the kind of group that pays attention to brands, to appearances, to subtle hierarchies. Claire was at the center of it. She turned when I walked in, her smile immediate and practiced. "There he is," she said, her voice carrying just enough to draw attention. "The man of the hour." That phrasing struck me as odd, but I let it go. "Good to see you," I said, stepping forward. She leaned in for a quick air kiss kind of greeting, not quite contact, not quite genuine. "Everyone," she announced, gesturing toward me, "this is Daniel's dad." Not my name, not even a simple introduction. Just a role. I nodded politely to the group. A few murmured greetings came back, polite but distant. I wasn't part of their circle, and that was clear immediately. That didn't bother me. I wasn't there for them. I took a seat near the edge of the room, nursing a glass of water while conversations flowed around me. Work gossip, vacation plans, complaints about rising costs, nothing unusual. Claire moved effortlessly between groups, always talking, always getting the energy. And then at some point, the conversation shifted. I don't remember exactly how, it was subtle. Someone mentioned childcare, I think, the cost, the stress. "That's actually something we just figured out," Claire said, her tone light, almost amused. Daniel glanced at her just briefly, not alarmed, just aware. "Oh," one of the women asked, "how?" Claire took a sip of her wine, then smiled. "Well," she said, "we are very fortunate." There was a pause, the kind designed to invite curiosity. "Our daycare is being completely covered." A few impressed murmurs followed. "Wow, that's amazing." "Seriously, for the whole year?" Claire nodded, then tilted her head slightly, toward me. "It's all him," she said. For a moment I thought that was it, a simple acknowledgement. I was wrong. She laughed. Not loudly, not cruelly, at least not on the surface, but there was something underneath it, something sharp. "He offered out of nowhere," she continued, "just decided to take care of it." One of the men raised his eyebrows. "That's generous." Claire smiled wider. "Generous," she repeated. "Yeah, that's one word for it." Something in the room shifted, subtle but noticeable. I felt it before I fully understood it. Then she said it. "I think he's trying to buy relevance." The words landed softly. But they didn't feel soft. A few people chuckled, not full laughter, just enough to signal agreement without committing to it. I didn't move. Didn't speak. I just looked at her. Claire met my gaze for half a second, then looked away, like it wasn't worth holding. "Claire," Daniel said quietly, a hint of discomfort in his voice. She waved him off. "Oh, relax," she said, "I'm joking." Then she glanced back at the group, smiling again. "You know how parents get. Once there's a baby, suddenly they want to be involved in everything." Maury laughed. Light, casual. Safe. I turned my attention to Daniel. He looked at me, then away, then back again. There was a moment, a very small one, where he could have said something. Anything. He didn't. She's just joking, he said instead. That was it. That was the line. Not an apology, not a correction, not even an attempt to shift the conversation. Just dismissal. I nodded once. Not in agreement, not in acceptance. Just acknowledgement. Then I stood up. I should be going, I said. Clea blinked, surprised, but only slightly. Oh, come on, she said, you just got here. I have an early morning, I replied. A lie, but a necessary one. Daniel followed me to the door. Dad. It's fine, I said before he could finish. Because in that moment, I understood something clearly. It wasn't fine. But explaining that wouldn't change anything. He hesitated, she didn't mean it. I looked at him. Really looked at him. She said it, I replied. That was the only truth that mattered. I left without another word. The drive home was quiet, no music, no distractions. Just the steady hum of the road and the weight of something settling into place. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder. Clarity. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had already made a decision. Not emotional, not reactive. Measured. Because if there's one thing I've learned over decades of business, it's that people reveal exactly who they are when they think there are no consequences. Clea thought it was a joke. Daniel thought it wasn't worth addressing. They were both wrong. And by the end of that week, they were going to understand exactly how wrong. The week after that dinner was suffocating in a way I hadn't anticipated. Not suffocating physically, my house, my office, even the small cafe I frequented in the mornings remained the same, but suffocating psychologically, because suddenly every interaction with Daniel and Clea carried a new, subtle tension. Every call, every text, every "how's Lily?" felt like stepping on a wire stretched just slightly too tight. I kept busy as I always do, reviewing contracts, checking property portfolios, making calls, the kind of work that keeps you busy and makes the world feel orderly, but nothing could fully distract me from what had happened. Clea's words weren't just a slight, they were a calculated dismissal, a public undermining of my role as a grandfather and, by extension, my relevance in their lives. I tried to speak to Daniel. I called him twice during the week. Both times he deflected, saying she was just teasing or that I overreacted. By Friday, even I couldn't ignore it anymore. Daniel's attempts at reassurance felt hollow. It's fine, he said repeatedly, but I could hear the undertone. I don't want to make waves. She's in charge. I stayed silent, deliberately. There's a peculiar power in silence, something I had learned long ago in boardrooms and negotiations. Words can be twisted, intentions misread. Silence cannot. It communicates restraint, patience, and most importantly, attention. I let the silence stretch through the weekend, letting them believe the issue was buried, that I was willing to accept Clea's mockery without consequence. But I started paying closer attention, observing small details I hadn't noticed before, how she managed Daniel, how she handled Lily, how she positioned herself in their social circle, the casual arrogance, the subtle need to assert dominance. It was all there, all consistent, and all fixable, or more precisely, all correctable, but only by someone patient enough to act when the timing was perfect. I also started reviewing the daycare situation in detail. I knew she would check any document she received, proof of payment, invoices, maybe even contracts. I knew she would assume I was being generous, maybe even manipulative, but she would never see it coming if I changed the rules. And that's when the idea formed, quietly, without fanfare. I would not confront Clea with anger. I would not beg Daniel to intercede. I would let the law do my talking, because it is impartial, methodical, and merciless when given the chance. I hired a lawyer I trusted, a meticulous woman who rarely loses, even against people who think their charm can outweigh facts. I explained the situation. I didn't embellish. I didn't overstate. I simply laid out the facts. Clea's public mockery, the undermining of my role, the legalities of financial gifts, and the formal responsibilities tied to them. Within 2 days, the first documents were drafted, the kind of notice that would make any parent stop, think, and reconsider every action they had taken in the previous months. The letter wasn't a check. It wasn't a threat of monetary penalty. It was precise, legal, binding in ways that would immediately affect Clea's ability to make decisions unilaterally for Lily. I placed the envelope on my desk, staring at it for a long time. The weight of what I was about to do settled in. There was no malice here, not in the personal sense. This was strategic. This was the same way I had closed deals, mitigated risk, and ensured my investments were protected. In this case, the investment was family. By Wednesday, I dropped it in the mail. Priority, signature required. I did not watch the tracking obsessively. I had learned in decades of negotiations that impatience is the enemy of strategy. Meanwhile, Clea continued as if nothing had changed. She posted pictures of Lily, of her friends, of herself on social media. She made jokes at Daniel's expense, subtle digs at me, nothing too overt, just enough to provoke without consequence. That was her first mistake. Because when she opened that envelope, she would realize for the first time that generosity could be weaponized, that patience could be a strategy, that the man she thought she could dismiss with a laugh had quietly set the rules of engagement, and she had already lost. By Thursday evening, I received a call from Daniel. His voice was uneasy. "Dad, Claire got your letter. She's upset." I didn't answer immediately. I just listened, letting him fill the silence with fragments of panic and uncertainty. She's saying you're trying to control everything, that this is over the daycare payments." "Yes," I said quietly, "exactly." There was a pause, a long one. I could hear the tension through the phone line. Daniel cleared his throat. She's saying it's unfair." I let him speak. Then when he stopped, I said, "The law doesn't consider fairness. It considers responsibility." The line went quiet. I could imagine Clea packing, realizing that her careless mockery had consequences far beyond her immediate social circle. By the end of the week, the first ripple of panic hit their household, and that, I thought as I hung up, was just the beginning. After that week, I settled into a rhythm I hadn't felt since before Lily was born, a quiet, deliberate awareness. I wasn't angry in the traditional sense. Anger, I've learned, is a storm that burns out fast. This was something deeper, a cold, measured clarity. I could see exactly how things had shifted and precisely where the leverage lay. The envelope had done more than deliver a legal notice. It had changed the dynamic entirely. I watched from a distance as Clea moved through her days, first in subtle confusion, then in thinly veiled panic. It's astonishing, sometimes, how quickly someone confident can unravel when the rules they assumed were informal suddenly have weight. Daniel, for his part, was torn. He tried to smooth things over with Clea, telling her it was just a precaution, that I meant well, that everything would be fine. But she knew better. I had seen that look before, the one people get when they realize that the world isn't just going to bend for them. She hated it, and she hated me for creating it. That's when I began my own preparations, not with anger, but with patience and planning. I reviewed the daycare paperwork in detail, confirming every clause, every contingency. I made notes on communication, on legal responsibilities, on what could be leveraged without ever stepping outside the law. I wanted the power to move decisively when the moment came. I also began observing Clea more carefully, not with malice, but like a strategist evaluating the opposition. How she handled social situations, how she influenced Daniel, how she treated Lily. I needed to understand her patterns before I acted. And I noticed something important. Clea had blind spots. Confidence, when excessive, tends to breed them. She assumed that financial generosity equates to dependency or gratitude. She assumed that public mockery would go unchallenged. She assumed that Daniel's love for her would override any legal or moral pressure. All three assumptions were wrong. I spent evenings constructing a mental map of possible scenarios. Every confrontation, every emotional appeal, every public or private interaction had a predictable arc, but there were variables: Clea's pride, Daniel's indecision, friends' opinions. I accounted for them all. I didn't rush. The beauty of this situation was that time was my ally. She was moving recklessly, I was moving deliberately. During this period, I also began reflecting on my role, not as a father or grandfather, but as a participant in a complex social ecosystem. My aim wasn't revenge in the petty sense. I wasn't looking to humiliate her publicly. I was recalibrating the hierarchy that had been disrupted by her arrogance. She needed to understand, subtly but irrevocably, that generosity should never be mistaken for weakness, and that mockery has consequences, even when disguised as humor. I started small, calls to the daycare, confirming everything. I spoke directly with the director, asking about policies on unauthorized changes, drop-off times, emergency contact authority. The director was professional, helpful, and completely unaware of the underlying tension. Perfect, that knowledge was my toolkit. I filed notes meticulously. Every call, every detail, every procedural nuance could be used strategically if needed. Next, I revisited my financial arrangements. I had initially planned to handle payments quietly. That was no longer enough. I needed clarity, traceability, and above all, leverage. I arranged the accounts so that any attempt by Clea to alter or mismanage the payments would trigger immediate procedural safeguards. subtle, almost invisible, but entirely binding. And then came the psychological piece. I realized that the best revenge is never about a single act, it's about a shift in perception. Clea had to feel, gradually, that control was no longer hers alone, that she could not dismiss my role with a joke, that her assumption that generosity equals irrelevance was false. I began planting seeds, casual comments, small observations, mentioning daycare procedures in conversation, asking questions that required thought, notes left in her view but not obviously confrontational, everything designed to make her second-guess her earlier confidence, to feel that her actions had consequences she hadn't anticipated. Meanwhile, I kept a careful distance. Daniel remained loyal to Clea, oblivious to the larger chessboard. That was fine. His loyalty would soon become a tool, but it needed to be positioned correctly. Push too soon, and he would become defensive. Wait, and he would inadvertently validate the change I was orchestrating. By the end of the second week, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Anticipation, not excitement, not thrill. Anticipation measured, patient, deliberate, like a fisherman waiting for a bite, knowing exactly when to strike. I was awake in a way that Clea never anticipated. Every word, every gesture, every decision was now part of a larger framework. And the most important realization hit me quietly at night as I reviewed notes in my study. She would not see it coming. Not the execution, not the consequences, not the full scope. And that's when I knew the plan was no longer just theoretical. It was actionable. Every step I had taken since that first laugh at the dinner table had been leading here. The awakening wasn't about revenge yet. It was about preparation, about positioning, about waiting until the world tilted in exactly the way I needed it to. Clea thought she had control. She thought she was untouchable in her small social orbit. But the next moves would make her realize that patience, meticulous planning, and legal precision can accomplish what anger never could: total recalibration of power. And so I waited quietly, confidently, with a calm that to anyone watching might have seemed like serenity, but beneath it was a storm gathering, deliberate and unstoppable. The execution didn't begin with a dramatic confrontation. That's amateur work, public displays of outrage, heated arguments, overt threats. I had never done anything that way in business, and I certainly wasn't about to do it in my family. My approach was methodical, legal, and psychologically precise. I knew that the real power lay in the subtle shift of control. The first move was procedural. Using the research I had done with the daycare, I submitted a formal request to the center: verification of guardianship, legal authority over Lily, and explicit clarification of who could make financial and administrative decisions on her behalf. The request was standard, innocuous, but it forced Clea to confront a reality she hadn't anticipated. The law recognized my contributions formally, not just socially. 2 days later, the director called me. "Everything is in order. We just need signatures on these updated documents to reflect your authorized role." Perfect, nothing aggressive, nothing emotional, but the paperwork now gave me a legitimate say in Lily's daycare schedule, contact policies, and even billing oversight. Clea, when she opened the envelope containing the forms, froze. That was the first taste of panic, the subtle, creeping realization that generosity can have teeth. Next, I began a quiet campaign of informational nudges. Not emails that looked confrontational, not phone calls that implied threat, just factual, precise updates. We need confirmation for the medical forms. Annual tuition requires signature. Policy requires 1 week notice for schedule changes. Each one framed in a calm, administrative tone, but strategically timed to place her in a position where ignoring them was impossible. The beauty of this was psychological. Clea, who had mocked me for trying to buy relevance, was now dependent on me to navigate the very system she thought she controlled. She started responding with curt emails, subtle passive-aggressive comments, but I never acknowledged them. I simply followed procedure, every action framed in law and policy, neutral, impersonal, unassailable. Meanwhile, Daniel remained caught in the middle. He attempted gentle mediation, but I stayed neutral toward him, letting him see both sides clearly. I never pressured him, never asked him to pick a side. His loyalty to Clea would soon become a tool of leverage. He would witness the shift of control in action and internalize it without realizing he was validating my authority. Then came the public piece. Clea loved appearances. She thrived on social perception, subtly asserting dominance in every gathering. I waited for the right moment, a small gathering at her friend's house, casual, nothing large. I arrived punctually, quietly. No announcements, no gestures, just presence. During the casual chatter about Lily's daycare, I spoke only when necessary. The forms require signatures by Monday. Nothing more, neutral, informational, procedural. But everyone present noticed the calm authority in my tone. Clea flinched visibly. Her friends, who had laughed at her clever quips in the past, noticed. The room shifted subtly. She could no longer dominate the narrative the way she had before. Next, I took a calculated risk. I drafted a legally binding memo clarifying the responsibilities and oversight tied to Lily's daycare, including provisions for emergency decisions, financial accountability, and policy compliance. I sent it to the daycare and a copy to Claire. Neutral language, professional tone, highlighting only what the law and policy required. When she opened it, her eyes widened. Her first thought was outrage, but before she could frame it publicly, she had to acknowledge it privately. The memo effectively forced her to recognize that her prior mockery and dismissive behavior had consequences. Every sarcastic laugh, every "he's trying to buy relevance" comment was now under scrutiny, formal, documented, and legally backed. At home, she confronted Daniel quietly. Panic laced her voice. "He's overstepping, he can't, he won't." Daniel, flustered, didn't have a ready argument. "It's all legal. He's following the rules," he admitted, almost reluctantly. "Exactly." By now, the execution had two effects simultaneously: practical control over the daycare and psychological dominance in the household. Claire had no idea which steps I might take next, but she could feel the invisible leash tightening. She couldn't lash out without undermining herself further. She couldn't ignore it without appearing negligent. And that was the moment I realized, true revenge doesn't require public spectacle. It doesn't need dramatic confrontation. It requires patience, precision, and inevitability. Every document, every phone call, every neutral reminder was a nail in the coffin of her assumed control. The final layer of the first stage involved subtle public positioning. In casual social circles, I mentioned in passing how the daycare requires signatures and oversight, neutral, almost bureaucratic. Friends nodded politely, but Claire noticed the implication. Her earlier mockery was now socially visible, even if veiled. That quiet erosion of reputation, the social proof that she wasn't in control, was often more damaging than any argument or confrontation. By the end of the first month, the initial shock had set in. Claire's confidence was shaken. Daniel was cautiously observing, and I remained calm, detached, observing the cascade of effects I had set in motion. All that remained now were two things: patience and the next move. The storm had begun, and she was standing in it, unaware. Just as I thought the plan was progressing smoothly, a complication arose, one I hadn't anticipated. I had assumed Claire's panic would be contained to administrative frustration and social embarrassment, but people are unpredictable. And while I had prepared for legal resistance, I hadn't prepared for a calculated counterstrike from someone I had underestimated. It started with a text from Daniel late one evening. Short, terse, almost hesitant. "Dad and Claire found something. She says you're trying to manipulate her with the daycare stuff. She's involving her lawyer." My first reaction was a calm, measured pause. I wasn't angry. I wasn't caught off guard in the strategic sense. I had accounted for the possibility of legal pushback, but the timing was surprising. She had spent the previous weeks under the assumption that subtle procedural dominance was enough to unsettle her. Apparently, the woman I had mocked as impulsive and self-assured wasn't done yet. She was retaliating. The next day, a formal letter arrived, stamped with the insignia of a law office I hadn't encountered before. Claire's handwriting on the envelope was neat, precise, the kind of meticulousness that reveals both pride and panic. Inside, the letter outlined her concerns, suggesting that my involvement in Lily's daycare could be interpreted as overreach, that she felt undermined, and that any further unilateral action could constitute harassment. I read it slowly, word by word, savoring the layers. Every accusation she made was predictable, but she had added one unanticipated detail. She included a clause implying she might seek sole authority over financial decisions for Lily under the argument that I was interfering. This could have been a disaster. The daycare's legal framework gave me authority, but if Claire's lawyer filed for exclusivity in court, it could trigger a formal dispute. Public exposure, legal fees, drawn-out proceedings, the very chaos I had sought to avoid. Most people would have panicked. I didn't. I leaned back in my chair, steepling my fingers. I had anticipated this. Part of me even relished the twist. This was the moment where skillful planning would separate itself from mere opportunism. I reviewed her letter carefully. Every claim she made could be countered factually. Every implied accusation could be disproven with documentation. I already had call logs, emails, signatures, and formal daycare policies. The foundation I had quietly built was solid. But the subtle brilliance came next. Instead of responding immediately, I waited. I let the tension simmer. Daniel was in the middle, anxious, trying to mediate, but he had no leverage. Claire's lawyer would expect a reaction. Any overreaction, any misstep could be used against me. I had to be calm, almost unbothered, like a predator watching prey that doesn't yet realize it's trapped. I also used the opportunity to subtly shift social perception. I reached out to the daycare director, not with anger or complaint, but simply to confirm that all documentation was in order and that no changes were being made without proper authorization. The director's calm confirmation would later serve as independent validation that all my actions were above board. Then I planted a seed that would amplify the tension. I mentioned, in passing to Daniel, it's interesting how sometimes people try to rewrite reality when the rules are clear. Nothing direct, neutral, but calculated to unsettle Claire when she overheard or later recalled it. Over the next 48 hours, her panic grew. She realized her letter didn't intimidate me. Worse, she began second-guessing every previous mockery, every attempt to assert dominance in front of friends. Her confidence faltered subtly but visibly. That first moment of doubt was crucial. It was proof that even a seemingly minor twist, a legal challenge, could become the lever to real psychological control. And then came the final layer of the twist. I discovered that in her panic, Claire had confided in one of her friends, someone who had attended the dinner where she first mocked me. That friend, seeing the situation unfold and knowing the factual details, reached out quietly to Daniel, advising caution and suggesting that perhaps Claire had overstepped. It was unexpected, a social domino I hadn't anticipated, but it worked in my favor. Suddenly, Claire's confidence was being questioned not just by me or legally, but by her own circle. The very same people who had laughed at her joke were now silent, uncertain, watching the tide shift. I realized then that the first twist wasn't a setback, it was an amplifier. Claire's attempt at retaliation, rather than derailing my plan, had hastened the very outcome I wanted. She had exposed herself, not me. She had forced her own weaknesses into the open, and I would use them to the fullest. By the time I sat down that evening with a glass of bourbon, I felt a quiet satisfaction. My first thought wasn't vengeance, it was anticipation. The storm had shifted, the pieces had moved in my favor, and the next step, the turning point, was now within reach. She thought she could outmaneuver me, but in doing so, she had revealed exactly how predictable she was. And predictability is a weapon when wielded patiently, precisely, and legally. The turning point came quietly, almost imperceptibly, on a Wednesday afternoon. I had been monitoring the daycare communications, Claire's increasingly tense emails, and the subtle signals from Daniel. Everything was unfolding exactly as it should, but the moment that crystallized her defeat wasn't dramatic, it was psychological. Claire made a mistake. She assumed that because she had drafted a letter through her lawyer, the situation could be contained. She didn't realize that every administrative action, every legal requirement, and every procedural step I had put in place was entirely above board. Her panic, her emails, her passive-aggressive attempts to assert authority, all now served as evidence of her overreach. That day, the daycare director called me directly, neutral, professional, completely unaware of the underlying tension. "Mr. Carter," she said, "we just received another request from Mrs. Reynolds regarding Lily's schedule and billing authority. I wanted to confirm everything is clear on your end." "Yes," I said evenly. "All documentation is complete. Any adjustments will follow the procedures outlined in the signed agreements." The director's brief pause, followed by her calm acknowledgement, was exactly what I needed. Claire's authority was effectively neutralized. Not through confrontation, not through anger, but through formal acknowledgement by a third party that the rules favored me. Then came the subtle social layer. That evening, Daniel invited me over to help with a few things around the house. Claire was there, tense but trying to maintain her usual composure. I noticed it immediately, the tiny cracks in her carefully constructed confidence. She was watching me now, calculating, realizing that every move I made was deliberate and supported by facts. I spoke calmly about Lily's upcoming schedule, the daycare's policies, and some minor logistical details. Neutral tone, matter of fact, nothing aggressive, nothing accusatory, but every word reinforced the reality. My involvement was essential. She could neither ignore me nor undermine me without exposing herself to procedural and social scrutiny. Claire attempted a subtle challenge, questioning a minor scheduling decision. I responded with clarity, citing the daycare's written policies and prior agreements. Her challenge faltered mid-sentence. The tension was palpable. Daniel, ever loyal to her, noticed it too. "What do you mean by that?" Claire asked, trying to assert control. "I mean exactly what the policy says," I replied evenly. "The signed agreements specify who has authority. Any changes need proper documentation. That's all." Her eyes flicked toward Daniel, silently pleading for support. He hesitated, then said nothing. Not because he wanted to side against her, but because he understood, deep down, that procedure and law were now the definitive arbiters. And that's when I realized the real turning point had occurred. Claire's power was no longer based on social dominance or charm. It had been replaced by structure, law, and meticulous planning, domains she had assumed she could ignore. Her confidence, once almost impenetrable, had begun to crack. By Thursday morning, the first ripple of fear became visible. Claire called her lawyer again, frustrated, desperate, but now forced to confront the undeniable reality. Her previous assumptions about control were false. My patience, my careful planning, and my neutral but persistent presence had created an environment where her authority could no longer operate unchecked. Even more satisfying was Daniel's response. He began observing rather than intervening. He asked questions, sought clarity, and without knowing it, validated my position by treating my guidance as necessary and rational. Claire's own husband, her supposed ally, had become a subtle instrument in my plan. The final evidence of the turning point came in an email from Claire herself, a short, clipped note. "I'm not sure what else you need, but I expect all future communication to be through formal channels." She thought she was limiting me. In reality, she had just acknowledged my authority formally, in writing, in a way that couldn't be easily disputed. Every bureaucratic and psychological lever I had placed was now activated. I sat back in my chair that evening and allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. She had realized, too late, that her mockery, her assumption of irrelevance, and her casual dismissal had been catastrophic miscalculations, and it had all been done without a single raised voice, without drama, and entirely within legal and social bounds. The storm was now fully upon her. She had no idea how far it would reach or how completely it would strip away the illusions of control she had so arrogantly wielded. The turning point had been reached, and from here, it was only a matter of time before the final layers of strategic recalibration fell into place. Just when I thought the path was clear, that Claire had been forced into a position of compliance and subtle panic, a second twist emerged, one I hadn't fully anticipated. It came in the form of a casual comment from one of her friends at a brunch Daniel invited me to, a comment that made my pulse quicken, not with fear, but with anticipation. "She really didn't see it coming, did she?" the friend whispered to Daniel, glancing subtly in my direction. Daniel frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "She thought she could outsmart you," the friend said, "but it's all by the book, and now everyone knows she can't just make decisions for Lily without involving you." I remained silent, sipping my coffee. I let the exchange happen without interjecting. Every word was confirmation. Claire had underestimated me not once but twice, first with the dinner mockery, then with her legal pushback. The second twist wasn't just that her panic had deepened, it was that her own social circle had started to notice. That realization hit her almost immediately. By that evening, I received a call from Daniel, voice low and urgent. "Dad, she's trying something new. She's suggesting that she might pull Lily out of daycare entirely unless you step back." I didn't flinch, that too had been anticipated. Pulling Lily out would have consequences for her, not me. I reviewed my options carefully. The daycare agreements were airtight, and removing Lily without proper notice could trigger procedural issues that legally reflected poorly on her. But there was an even more potent tool here, the psychological angle. I drafted a formal response. Not emotional, not aggressive, completely procedural, professional, citing the daycare's policies and the signed agreements. I highlighted that any unilateral changes required formal notice and proper documentation, as specified. I copied Daniel on the email so he could see the factual, neutral tone. When Claire received it, she realized she had no choice. She couldn't manipulate the situation through threats or social pressure. Every move I had made was now verifiable, recorded, and legally binding. And because Daniel had been included, she couldn't appeal privately without exposing her actions. Then came the social twist. The friend who had mentioned her miscalculation contacted me discreetly. "She's talking to everyone now," they said. "She's worried people will think she's overreacting, that she's losing control." Claire's paranoia had now crossed into the social realm. Friends who had once admired her composure were now questioning her decisions. She was isolated, not overtly, not publicly humiliatingly, but in the subtle, devastating way that slowly erodes confidence. Here, where it got even better, Claire, desperate to regain control, began making small, reckless attempts to assert authority over Lily. A missed deadline here, a tone of frustration there, an email sent without full documentation. Each instance only reinforced my position. Every misstep was evidence of why the legal and procedural framework existed, my framework. By this point, I realized the second twist had fully materialized. Claire's own overconfidence and attempts at retaliation were accelerating the very outcome I had engineered. Her panic was now compounded by her social perception, her procedural missteps, and her private realization that she had underestimated me twice in 1 month. I watched patiently as the dominoes fell. By the end of the week, Claire was visibly more cautious, quieter in social interactions, slower to respond, and unsure of every move she made around me. The laughter she had once enjoyed at my supposed attempts at relevance had disappeared. She was calculating every interaction carefully, as if trying to predict my next step, and that was exactly what I wanted. The second twist, in essence, wasn't external. It wasn't a legal obstacle, nor a dramatic confrontation. It was the amplification of the first mistake, her underestimation of my patience and strategy. The game had shifted entirely. She was now playing on my terms without realizing it, and the consequences of each move were dictated not by her will, but by the rules, the agreements, and my quiet, relentless control. At that moment, I understood something profoundly satisfying. The most devastating consequences often come not from overt action, but from the combination of preparation, timing, and the unanticipated self-sabotage of the opponent. Claire had become the architect of her own unraveling, and all I had done was orchestrate the conditions for it to happen. And the final stage was now within reach. The fallout, reversed entirely, where her miscalculations would become the foundation of her defeat. By the start of the following week, the effect of every step I had taken was undeniable. Claire's confidence had eroded entirely. She was no longer the assertive, socially dominant figure she had been. She now approached every interaction with measured caution, scanning for mistakes, anticipating every procedural move I might make. The very arrogance that had once fueled her mockery had become her cage. The daycare, which had seemed a neutral environment, was now an instrument of quiet authority. Every policy clause I had previously verified became a lever to keep her in check. Any attempt to override me or bypass the formalities would trigger an immediate procedural response from the director, neutral, professional, and most importantly, unassailable. Claire understood this implicitly, though she could not admit it. Daniel, meanwhile, began observing the entire situation with a mix of relief and quiet alarm. He had finally started to see the contrast between impulsive arrogance and deliberate strategy. Every time Claire tried to assert control, and was met with calm, procedural authority, he realized that my patience and preparation had not only protected Lily, but also ensured fairness and safety in a way his wife could not achieve alone. He started following my lead in minor ways, almost instinctively, without me asking him to. The social fallout was equally effective. Claire, once the life of every gathering, now hesitated before speaking, aware that any casual boast or jab might expose her ignorance of the legal and administrative realities I had carefully documented. Friends who had previously laughed at her cleverness began noticing the subtle tension in her behavior. A glance here, a flinch there, small signs that something had shifted. In private conversations, they began expressing quiet admiration for my calm authority, and a subtle distance grew between Claire and her previous social supporters. The most satisfying layer, however, came from Claire herself. She realized she could no longer control or influence the situation through sarcasm, charm, or intimidation. Every move she made was monitored, every communication was now formalized, and every misstep was a documented reminder of her prior arrogance. Her mockery, the casual laughter aimed at me, had not only failed but had set in motion her own unraveling. One evening, Daniel came to me quietly while Claire was occupied. "Dad, she's finally realizing, isn't she?" he asked. A mix of awe and relief in his voice. "Yes," I said calmly, "and that realization is irreversible." The envelope, the first step, had already done its work, but it was the chain of calculated actions that had solidified the outcome. Each letter, each phone call, each neutral administrative correction had combined to form a structure that Claire could neither circumvent nor control. Every prior assumption she had made about influence, dominance, and relevance had been systematically dismantled. By now, Claire's tone had changed entirely. Emails to the daycare became polite, almost deferential, with careful attention to detail. Requests for schedule changes were made formally, with proper documentation. She no longer attempted social dominance in front of friends or family, recognizing, perhaps subconsciously, that the rules now favored me. Even Daniel noticed the complete shift. For the first time, he turned to me for guidance without hesitation, not because he feared me, but because he recognized the efficacy of strategy over impulse. My relationship with him strengthened, built not on confrontation, but on consistent, measured authority. And the final blow, though subtle, was the most satisfying. Claire began speaking of me differently in her private circle, with hesitant admiration, cautious respect, and a new awareness of my quiet influence. The same woman who had mocked me as irrelevant had now internalized the reality. Generosity paired with preparation can be more powerful than arrogance or social cunning. She had become an unintentional advocate for the very authority she had once sought to dismiss. By the end of that month, the balance had shifted completely. Claire's attempts at mockery, social manipulation, and casual dominance had been neutralized. Daniel recognized my foresight and composure. Lily's welfare was secured under structured, lawful oversight, and the psychological and social consequences for Claire were total. She had underestimated me, she had overstepped, and now she had no choice but to operate within the boundaries I had quietly established. The tables had turned. Every ounce of arrogance she had displayed was now evidence of her own miscalculation. And through patience, strategy, and law, the outcome was absolute. Control had been recalibrated, not through anger, not through confrontation, but through deliberate, unstoppable, inevitable action. It all came down to one quiet evening, weeks after the storm had begun. Claire was in the living room with Lily carefully filling out daycare forms under my watchful eye. Daniel was nearby, observing without interference, silently acknowledging the shift that had occurred. And I was calm, composed, entirely satisfied. Claire glanced up from her paperwork, eyes betraying the mix of resignation and reluctant respect that I had been cultivating all along. She no longer spoke in jest, no longer tried to assert dominance with subtle digs or laughter. Every interaction was measured, cautious, aware that the rules had shifted in ways she could not undo. "You've handled this well," she said softly, almost a whisper, as if confessing to herself. I didn't smile, I didn't respond immediately. There was no need for theatrics. Silence, after all, speaks volumes. Finally, I said, with the calm finality of someone who had orchestrated every detail. "Generosity isn't weakness, and mockery has consequences." She looked down, nodding slightly, and for the first time I saw the lesson sink in. Her laughter, her casual dismissal, her attempts at control, they had all been neutralized, reversed, and rendered entirely powerless. Every miscalculation she had made had become the foundation of her own unraveling. And with that I left the room, letting her reflect, letting Daniel observe, letting the equilibrium settle. The victory wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was quiet, absolute, and undeniable. Because sometimes, the most satisfying revenge isn't in the spectacle, it's in the inevitability. And in that inevitability, I realized something profoundly satisfying. You don't have to raise your voice to win. You just have to move when everyone else is standing still.